Okay, so that's the recording in progress. Thanks for that, Ian. I
No
was
problem.
really getting in my stride there and realized I was far too quick. Oh, I've got flustered now. What's the next thing I do here? Share share screen. Now here we go. I got it. Right. So hopefully everyone can still hear me. And
You're all good.
yeah, we're good. Okay, so again, I'm just going to quick start again. I'm just going to introduce the work of Dr. Ricky Gerd Hammer, who on his, when he departed this living plane in 2017, he had done a mass of information with cases well in excess of 40,000. And of every single one of those cases where he helped people overcome all kinds of conditions, every condition basically that you can get in a medical dictionary, his discovery of 5 biological laws were are proven themselves to be entirely accurate in every single one of those cases. So that's pretty good to be 100% true and correct in over 40,000. So it's to me it just feels absolutely true, and I'm just going to tell everyone about it now. So let's hope something happens here. Okay, so introducing the 5 biological laws. It is a lesson in life and health, because, and I put the word life in there because I believe that there's such wisdom in the body, because it's taken a lot of time through process of evolution or creation, whichever way you go on that. But I tend to sort of go to the evolutionary side of things. But either way, it's taken a lot of effort or a long time to evolve to where we are, and there's a huge amount of life wisdom in the creation of us. And in this presentation, I hope there's no too many spelling mistakes in it, because I am dyslexic, but I have asked it to be checked apart from this one page here. So let's hope this is okay. This presentation is to bring to your awareness that we are in control of our bodies in health and disease, and that the symptoms of both are under the control of a part of our brain function known as the psyche. So that's saying basically the psyche is controlling our bodies in sickness and in health. This presentation is to bring to your attention that the psyche acts as an interface between our perceived environment and our internal adaptive response to that environment. So the psyche monitors through all our senses what's going on, and if something traumatizes it, it makes a change in the body to help us in that situation. There's somebody who perhaps needs to mute themselves, because I'm hearing somebody cough there. So if anyone can see who that's not muted, they can mute themselves. This presentation is to bring to your attention that all disease and symptoms of ill health are caused by this adaptive process, and the overall purpose of this natural process is to keep us alive individually and as part of a self-regulating group or pack or tribe. These adaptive processes have been programmed into us through evolution, and when understood from this perspective, they make sense. And what that means is, when, you know, because if you're sitting here with a horrible disease like cancer, you think, oh, well, what's the point of this? This is not helping me. Well, when you look at that biological process from the perspective of when the body developed it, it did make sense to us, according to Dr. Hammer's research. And it's very convincing. Because we're talking about health, I'd just like to read this disclaimer. This presentation and the information in it is presented to you for your interest only. It's not given or intended as medical advice or diagnosis regarding your health. If you do have a health problem, you're advised to consult a medical doctor. So I hope that's okay with everyone. And if that's not okay, then perhaps you don't need to listen to any more of it. Right. So Dr. Hammer discovered 5 biological laws, and these laws are the laws which control our health, either good health or what we think at the moment as not good health. The first law he discovered after contracting cancer himself, and he contracted cancer. He was an extremely healthy man, a very fit, very strong man, big guy, and never been ill in his life. He had 3 doctorates, or one of them in medicine. He was very healthy, but in 1979, he was the head internist doctor in a cancer research clinic in Munich. And he got a phone call which floored him. And the phone call was that his son had been critically wounded in a shooting accident. He went to help his son, and he took over the treatment of his son, but his son died about 2 months later. Within weeks of that, he developed a cancer, and it was a testicular cancer, and he had the testicle removed, and he was, if you like, lucky, and he was back at work come some months after that. So when he got back to work, he wondered if the shock he had suffered had caused his cancer. It was quite he was a scientist, he's an inventor. So he went on a mission to answer that question, and he very quickly did, because what he did was he interviewed every single one of his clients, and there were hundreds. And lo and behold, all of these people that he was treating for cancer had had a trauma, and the trauma was still unresolved. So from that, he thought, there's a connection here. And then he did a lot more research and eventually ended up scanning the CT scanning the brains of people, and realized that the brain showed up as a controlling factor in the development of their diseases. So the first rule is that he discovered was that every disease, including cancer, but not limited to cancer, begins with a shock. Big shocks end up in big stuff like cancer, and little shocks end up in little stuff like athlete's foot. He named these shocks a DHS because his son, the name of his son was Dirk. So he called it the Dirk Hammer syndrome, because we named it after his son, but the syndrome, the type of shock that Dr. Hammer is describing here, it's got specific qualities, because not every shock makes us ill. We have shocks all the time, and we're not ill all the time. But if a shock has certain qualities to it and affects us in a certain way, we do get symptoms. So he called these shocks DHS, and these shocks create within us a biological need to change. We call them biological conflicts. And what have I written here? Within our psyche, and this causes our bodies to react biologically to overcome the shock. Our body is actually trying to help us deal with a life issue, and it does it in a practical way. So if we have a shock, say, we get a piece of news which we think might be extremely dangerous for our health. Let's say, one of the things that Dr. Hammer accounts a lot, or used to account a lot, was a diagnosis shock. So a lot of people would maybe go for a test, and then they would go back in to see the doctor, and the doctor would say, "Oh, you've got stage 3 cancer," and the person would be, traumatized by that shock. And what he discovered was that trauma would very often create a death fright in the person. So a death fright, a fear of their death. And that death fright would trigger the lungs to start creating lung cancer, or to create more tissue as a matter of fact. And the lungs did it for a reason, to try and help that person live through that trauma, even though through our ignorance of this process, it certainly did not help. Okay. So our body actually is trying to help us deal with a life issue, and does it in a practical way. So where am I here? What's the next thing? Our psyche controls this adaptive process. It is not a conscious process. So don't mix up. We must separate completely thinking about these life issues and shocks and things. We must separate conscious and the psyche. They're two different things. The psyche can be aware of what's going on consciously in us, but it's not the same thing. It's kind of like sitting in a separate room from the conscious mind. So the psyche controls this adaptive process. It's not a conscious process. The body that we live in is capable of being triggered to adapt in ways which evolution has created within us. And in that sentence, what I mean is that we, as this conscious thing that, like me right now, I'm sort of stumbling my way through this presentation. So that's the conscious me, but that's only a part of me. My conscious mind is only a small part of what my brain does. And within me, within my body, there's this other mind, the psyche, which is looking after the maintenance and care and repair of my body. So we're talking about a shock starts all disease. The shock has three qualities. The first quality is it's as sudden and unexpected as shocks are. Okay. The next quality is we experience that shock without a feeling of support or with a sense of isolation. So that's what it means. We feel it like we're unsupported in that moment. And the third criteria is that the shock is deeply felt, and that means it's highly significant for that person in that moment that they experience it. So the shock has three qualities. It's sudden. We feel it. Feel it with a sense of isolation, and it's really important to us in some key way at that moment in time. This is what the shocks do, everyone. Now, these are two scans. They're not high quality. I've just dragged it, cut and pasted them from the internet, from the actual website that I am going to reference at the end of this presentation. So on the slide on the left, you're going to see this two sets of yellow arrows, and then there's a group of red arrows. Now, to a very trained eye that looks at these scans every day, there are three parts of the brain which have been activated by this shock. The two yellow ones control the muscle that the heart is made of, and the arrows define the part of the brain which Dr. Hammer has discovered controls the coronary artery. So these are major structures in the heart. The other slide is a brain scan of a woman who will have suffered a nest conflict. And you can see the yellow arrow, there's quite a clearly defined circle there. And that is the part of the brain which controls the breast glandular tissue. So that's the part of the breast that makes milk to feed infants. And that woman will have suffered what Dr. Hammer calls a nest worry. That's a worry over the well-being of somebody she regards as her nest. And for a woman, that is her children or something she cares for, or her mother. Not her father, because the father would have appeared on the other side of the brain and would affect the other breast. Right. The next part of the laws are that the type of shock we experience, or the type of shock our psyche experiences, determines whereabouts in the brain this pattern, which I've just shown you in the last slide, these patterns appear. So if the shock is manifest within, I hope you can see my little cursor here. If it's manifest within the brainstem, then this part of the brain, or if it's relevant to the brainstem, then this part of the brain will have the circular pattern in it, which will be there every time, and it will be what's called a morsel conflict. If it's in the cerebellum, then it'll be an attack conflict or a nest worry conflict, which is where the breast cancer I showed you about was, or it would be a feeling soil conflict, which is a skin type issue. If it was in this cerebral medulla, then it's a self-devaluation conflict, and that will affect other tissues in the body. But what that means is a self-devaluation conflict means in the moment of the shock, we didn't feel good enough to cope in some way. And then the last one, which I'm looking at now, is the cortex. And the cortex is a big part of the brain. It covers the whole brain, and it's made up of different parts. But to sort of, really thin it down a bit, it's separation conflicts or motor conflicts in the motor cortex, or there's conflicts which affect the parts of the pancreas, for example, and it ends up in giving us diabetes or hypoglycemia. Okay, so I've included these here, but there's hundreds of them. Okay, these are just examples. So what we've got from this slide is that the shock theme determines the location, and I've just given you some examples there of what themes are where. The next slide is the same slide, but we're looking at the location now. So the location, let's go to the brainstem. This location of the brain controls all of the endodermal tissue in the body. Amazing discovery, absolutely mind-blowingly important. All of the tissue that's endodermal is controlled by the brainstem. That means to say, if you've got a problem with tissue, like say in your large bowel, right? Well, that problem is going to be controlled from that part of the brain. Now that is incredible, because in that statement, it means that we don't contract diseases. We don't catch thrush. If you've got thrush in the mouth, for example, oral thrush, well, it's not because you've got an infection. It's because the body is managing that process. And if you did a brain scan within the part of that brainstem which represents the mouth, you will be able to see it. If with a trained eye, you can see it, and it will be controlling that process that's going on. So you don't catch thrush, your body creates it for a purpose, and I'll discuss that later. So this slide really just says that, for example, skin conditions are controlled from the red. Bone conditions and anything attached to the bone is controlled from that yellow bit there. The breast glands and also what's called the corium skin, which is the underskin, is controlled from there, and the digestive system, very much of it is controlled from there. Smooth muscle as well is controlled from what's called the midbrain. So like digestive colics are controlled from that. So the location, so parts of the brain control specific parts of the body, and it all follows a beautiful system. And the last slide of these three shows that the brainstem controls conditions such as liver cancer, bowel cancer, irritable inflammatory bowel disease, lung cancer, water retention, canker sores, thrush. So there's conditions that are all controlled from, in fact, if you have those conditions, Dr. Hammer shows us that that part of the brain is controlling them, because that part of the brain is trying to help you in some way, which doesn't make any sense, but it's just the way it is. Cerebellum is there. This controls, if you have acne, well, then it's the cerebellum that's causing that. If you have glandular breast cancer, as we've said, likewise. In the cerebral medulla, if you've got arthritis, that's where it's happening. Scoliosis, that's a deviation of the spine. That's where it's happening. Leukemia, that's blood cancer or bone cancer, as I think it's called. Well, that's where it's been controlled by for a reason. Muscle wastage, that's where it's controlled by. Gout, that's a very painful condition affecting the toes. Well, that is where it's controlled by mainly. There's another relay involved with gout, but we don't need to go there just now. And if you've got skin complaints like eczema, dementia, that's controlled by the sensory cortex. Rheumatism, that's the post-sensory cortex. Hemorrhoids, would you believe? Epilepsy, psoriasis, and all the other ones there. And there's many, many more. Okay, so what this really tells us is that different parts of the brain they control groups of diseases or symptoms, and it forms a perfect pattern there's no randomness to it, and it's controlled by a specific type of shock, and it's from a specific location, and it creates a specific symptom. So what we've got here is a biological process which has been proven to exist, and it's 100% repeatable. Amazing, I think. And the first law, the last part, is that when we suffer a shock which sets off this process of adaptation, I think I should say the word properly, shouldn't I? It runs in parallel in 3 levels of our being. The first level is within the psyche. So the psyche latches onto that issue, and it monitors that issue in real life, and it controls the brain, here we go, in real time. So if the issue gets worse, then the psyche monitors that, and the symptoms become more worse, if you like, or the brain gets more involved. Likewise, if the psyche perceives that the causes become less, then the actual disease will become less. So that's the difference between, say, a benign growth and a cancer. One of them, it's the same thing, but one of them is not active. That means that the trauma that's driving it, that the psyche's latched onto, is not strong enough. It's not really creating many cell divisions. So it's basically just sitting there, not growing. It's just sitting there. And so the psyche is tracking the issue real time. The brain is involved through this relay, and the part of the body which that brain is connected to grows a symptom of some type. So the one I've given you really is the lung cancer, because the lung cancer is programmed or controlled from the brainstem, and the 2 arrows are pointing at each lung there. So that's a sort of picture showing that the conflicts, like if anybody wants, if for people to generate a symptom, right, don't just think of that symptom as, oh, that doesn't belong to me. That symptom is you, right? Like eczema, for example, and there's part of your brain controlling that symptom, and there's part of your psyche monitoring the issue, which is controlling that symptom. Very important, because through knowledge is power, they say. So when you know what's going on, you can start to know what to do about that, which is the way to go, I reckon. The conscious mind may well be knowing what's happening, right? If it's a major problem, a major issue in life, it's maybe growing a cancer or something like that, then the conscious mind will be dwelling on that a lot, right? But things like that cause eczema may well date back to childhood or even pre-birth. Okay, you've got no conscious awareness of that, and it's not it sinks below our conscious awareness. So in that case, the conscious mind's not involved. But I put that in there just for sort of completeness, that sometimes the conscious mind knows about the trauma and is focused continually on resolving it, and other times not. So it's great. Now, the next thing is the second law. So everything we've talked about so far is talking about the shock. There's a shock which causes us to start a biological process, and within that process, we develop symptoms which most of us know as disease. Okay, we've established that. Oh, right, the next one. The second law, the law of the 2 phases. So that line down the bottom there, where where's my cursor? It's just moving along the line. Let's just imagine that that's like your normal function of your brain, right? It's just doing nothing. It's just cruising along the road, not really getting excited about too much at all. Okay, just going your daytime, your nighttime is going dead normal. Okay, so then we have a shock. Here we go. Let's say we have a shock, a biologically active shock. What does that do? It starts an adaptive process to help the organism resolve the biological conflict caused by the shock, which in German new medicine lingo is called a DHS. So that really shows us that when we have a shock, our body's control system, or the autonomic nervous system to be more exact, starts a process. When we resolve that shock, it starts a reversal process of everything that had gone on prior to the overcoming of it. So the body was adapting to help the person overcome the shock. And then when the shock becomes resolved, the body then cleans up the mess, if you like. It tries to put things back to normal. And that's the second part. And then when that's finished, we go back to normal. So what we've established here is that the second law tells us that every symptom that we have is part of a two-phase process. Most times we will not be aware of the first part of the process. We'll only be aware of the second, because that's when most symptoms appear. In the second part of the process is when eczema appears, when heart attacks appear, when epileptic seizures appear, when diarrhea happens with an IBD, for example, when inflammation happens, any inflammation. So what we trot off to the doctor with is actually in this pink area here. And that's when the symptoms come. But when we understand the German New Medicine, we realize, my symptoms started this morning. So I must have resolved something yesterday and my body's now in healing. I feel like I've got the flu, for example, or whatever the flu might be called at the moment, right? That tells you that you resolved some issue yesterday, and lo and behold, your body's feeling awful and groggy, and you've got a temperature and a sore head, and you're coughing up, and you've got a chest infection, whatever that might be called at the moment. And hey presto, you're actually in healing. Give it a couple, don't get worried about it, and give it time to sort itself out, maybe a week or 4 or 5 days, whatever. You'll be back to normal and good as new. So Dr. Hammer tells us that diseases is part of a two-phase system, which I've tried to discuss there. Now, this is the same thing again, part of a two-phase system, only a bit more complex, because this is a genuine German New Medicine drawing. And it basically shows that this wiggly line here is the autonomic nervous system, and it goes between day and night. The nighttime it's down here, and the daytime it's up here. These are the two branches of your autonomic nervous system. When we suffer the shock, what have I got to do? Press the button. Here we go. The shock happens there. Oh, sorry. When we suffer the shock, it throws the autonomic nervous system into constant, it's called sympathetic atonia. When we resolve the shock, it throws the autonomic nervous system into this double dip, but most of it's below in the red color, into a healing phase, which is controlled by the opposite branch of the autonomic nervous system, which is called the vagatonic branch. And then when it's all over, it's back to normal. So for example, you have, let's say, a stink conflict. The stink conflict happens here, the shock. Something smells bad in life, right? Maybe not physically smells, but it's like your body, your psyche thinks, oh, there's something fishy going on here, as they say. Maybe I'm going to lose my job or whatever, right? Or I don't trust that person, right? Well, in that, if that trauma happens, the membrane of the nose starts to adapt here. But when you actually get over that shock, let's say you end up making best friends with this person, and you realize, oh man, I really didn't judge that person properly. You go into healing. So the healing starts there where it's resolution, and you can see that you then start to get the snotty nose and the headaches and maybe the shivers, and you can see that it will last roughly as long as the conflict active. So the blue phase and the pink phase are roughly the same, and that's a two-phase process. So we now know that it involves the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is controlling the body to help adapt us to overcome the issue which started with the shock. That can be called the cold phase, because in the old days, doctors used to take your temperature and your hand temperature. And what we find is that if we're conflict active, we tend to have cold hands. And in healing, we tend to have a temperature and have hot hands. So it's a good way of checking yourself. So just to sum up, we've covered two laws. The first law is everything starts with a shock. The second law is that the shock starts a two-phase process, and somewhere in that process, our symptoms appear. The third law sounds pretty complex, the ontogenetic system of disease. What it means, to my understanding of it, is that the process of disease can be traced right back to the brain and to this thing, which I think is called a blastocyte or a fetus, which is basically a fertilized egg, which is 12 days old. That's what a fertilized egg at 12 days old looks like if you dissect it. And what we can see is that the 3 tissue types, well, it's actually 4 tissue types, but you can see the orange one is kind of similar. So I say 3, but I think it's 4, could be 3. Those tissue types appear here, defined in the dissected fetus at 12 days old. And then from that point on, they grow into the full brain when the child's born. And, you know, by the time we're born, we're pretty much complete. And we can see that the digestive system, for example, is controlled by the brainstem, and the brainstem comes from this bottom layer of this 12-day-old fetus. The skeleton is controlled by the orange here, and that comes from the orange. And the skin, for example, the epidermis is controlled by the little red shape on the top, and it eventually evolves into the cortex of the brain, the newest part of the brain, and it's the skins which cover our skin, and also other organs within the body, such as bones, are covered by skin as well, which not many people know. What have I said here? Okay. I know everyone's probably gone into overload, but I'm just going to say it anyway, and you don't worry if you don't remember it. If the program or the shock is lodged in the brainstem, we have cell augmentation when the conflict is active. So you develop cells. That can be called a cancer or a benign growth, depending on how fast they're growing. If the shock lands either in the cerebellum, well, again, that causes cell growth when active and cell removal when the shock is resolved. If the shock lands in the medulla, it causes the exact opposite. It causes cell removal. So, for example, everyone's heard of osteoporosis. That's what causes osteoporosis. The cells are being removed from the body. It's nothing to do with diet or vitamin D or sunlight. It's to do with the cerebral medulla having a self-devaluation conflict. And when that conflict's active, the cells are being removed. When the conflict goes into resolution, the cells get replenished, fully replenished. And the last one is the cortex. So the cortex, when the shock lands in the cortex, we have cell loss when the shock's active. And when the shock's in resolution, we have cell reconstitution. So the cell is rebuilt. So we can see that between what you say the old brain, which is like the old brain, that this yellow bit down here and that stripy yellowy orange bit, that's called the reptilian brain. The general theme is that we have cells that when the conflict is active, cells grow, and the exact opposite happens in the new brain. When the conflict is active, the cells become less. And the opposite happens when we resolve the conflict. So again, don't get chewed up about the detail here. There's a process, and it can be traced right back to the actual tiny little fetus 12 days after conception. I'm just going to skip that. Now, the fourth law. We've only got one more after this, so don't worry, right? The fourth law is that all these so-called things that cause disease, right, which at the moment we all know about a certain virus, there's bacteria and there's fungi, right? These are the three organisms which are thought to cause disease at the present, right? Now, if we go from fungi first, which is the bottom one of these circles here, right? Fungi are always involved in the body if the brainstem and the cerebellum have been involved with the shock. So if the shock landed in the brainstem or the cerebellum, when the issue goes into resolution, you're going to have candida or fungi of some type working to remove and to repair you back to normal again. Likewise, bacteria are also used in the brainstem and the cerebellum, specifically TB bacteria. So we've all heard of a disease called tuberculosis. Well, tuberculosis uses the tubercular bacteria, TB, and those TB were active trying to remove cells from the lungs causing TB, because people en masse after this First World War, for example, there was a TB epidemic. People en masse went into healing for a death fright, either personally or from their loved ones, because we can suffer a death fright for somebody as well as for ourselves. And that's what caused the TB outbreak after the First World War, for example. The tubercular bacteria became active trying to remove the now no longer needed cancer, which was initially caused by the death fright shock which people had experienced. Other bacteria, staphylococci, streptococci and such, they operate in the newer tissues of the body controlled by the cerebral medulla. And finally, viruses, which don't exist because that's now been pretty much solidly proven. So therefore, this did used to say that viruses were involved if they're proven to exist, but now we know that they don't exist. Then basically all healing that takes place in the new part of the brain, the cortex, does not really need any microorganisms at all. The body does it all by itself. So what this is saying to us, ladies and gentlemen, is that microorganisms such as bacteria and fungi are within our body, and they're managed by the psyche, and they play an active and very beneficial role in our healing. And we have to think twice, according to Dr. Hammer, we have to think twice about annihilating these bacteria at every opportunity, because that comes from a misunderstanding, according to Dr. Hammer, of the cause of what's actually going on in the body. And there's a little example of two conjoined twins that suffered complete different illnesses, even though they had the same blood supply going around the body. The same blood was passing through both of those twins, and yet one of them would have the flu and one would be perfectly fine, or one of them would have, candida, and the other one wouldn't, or one would have a cold and the other one wouldn't, right? So what that tells us is that, if the germs were causing these diseases, then they both have them because it's the same blood, right? But indeed, that's not the case. So which strongly suggests that Dr. Hammer is entirely correct. Very interesting that. And the fifth law, the last one, is that every disease is part of a biological process aimed at assisting us in resolving the biological conflict. And it makes complete and perfect sense if we understand this process through the context of evolution. So if we can somehow wind our brains back to how our bodies were back 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 million years ago, then we can see that these adaptive processes would have helped us in a biological way. And that's why we've got them. It's carrying over from our evolution, and we still have them. And if we know this, we can manage our symptoms. We can firstly know what's causing our symptoms, and then we can either manage to sort them out and get them, get rid of them, or at least understand them and remove the fear of them. I have some examples, right? For example, if the body, when we're having a fight, we have adrenaline, which helps us in some situations, having a fight, for example. But if you're trying to, say, play the violin for the first time on stage at the Christmas show, and you're full of adrenaline, it's probably the last thing you need, because you're going to be fingers and thumbs. Cancer, the wolf, let's say if the wolf chews an animal and a shard of bone gets stuck in the wolf's stomach, somewhere in its intestines, well, that wolf, the psyche of that wolf will create a secretory cancer, and which will secrete juices that will help dissolve and remove that bone. So it helps that wolf clear its digestive system of the bone. Whereas if a man say gets a court case stuck in his gullet, they might say, he likewise will develop a cancer to help get that issue dissolved from his life. Of course, he won't realize what's happening, and things will spiral out of control for him, and he will, go down the medical route, and he'll get worried about that, and there would be a lot of consequences from that. So not so good. Motor paralysis, MS, for example, there's a few types, but MS is the one I put down here. It's a fake dead reflex. For a bird that's been trapped by a cat, then a fake dead reflex helps save that bird, because it goes all floppy and the cat might drop the bird, and that gives the bird one last chance to escape. So for a bird, the fake dead reflex is a great thing, but for a human being who gets trapped in a situation they felt trapped in or unable to move out of, it starts muscle paralysis. And then because we don't know this, we'll get diagnosed with something, and then that'll cause maybe even more muscle paralysis, because if you get told you got MS, then, that puts the fear of being handicapped, paralyzed into you, which can cause more and more and more. It can be an ongoing self-fulfilling prophecy, as a matter of fact. And this slide, I wanted to put this slide in just to show that schizophrenic constellations are involved. So a constellation really is when we have a conflict active in both sides, both halves of the brain at the same time. And what this does, it upsets the function of the brain, and it can cause conditions even of the mind. Because everything I've talked about so far is of the body, right? Your cold sores and your candida, for example, I've talked about. But this, Dr. Hammer's research shows us that even things like mental confusion, narcissism, compulsion to move like a tic, manic depressive tendencies, somebody who's what they call a Casanova, or a nympho, which is a female version of such, bulimia, somebody who's maybe hearing voices or feels that they're getting followed all the time. These conditions also are explained by his work, and Dr. Hammer was very successful in actually healing people of these conditions. And what was really interesting was that as soon as Dr. Hammer, he tells us that it was not easy to resolve these schizophrenic constellations, but as soon as you do, the person gets better pretty much instantly. So it's quite amazing. Somebody could be troubled with like say bulimia for a long time, causing all kinds of troubles, and yet when you resolve the emotional issue that's causing it, they get better just as they sit in front of you. So it's quite amazing altogether. The fifth law tells us that everything that happens, all these diseases and everything else, is trying to help us overcome a life issue. Now, I've kind of suddenly ended up with the fifth law very quickly, I think, but that in a nutshell is what the body's trying to do. And it makes sense if we think about it that way. There's no point, there was just no evolutionary point in us having a body that tried to kill us. It just wouldn't have worked. But we do have a body that tries to keep us alive. And that's really the final discovery that he made. He was able to piece all this together and realize that from the perspective of evolution, the body is trying to keep us on the rocky road. What we previously knew as disease has now been proven to be our bodies adapting to help us survive under the control of the psyche as it responds to perceived and dangerous situations. Amazing. I think that's incredible. When we have an understanding of our symptoms, know what processes are going on within us and why it is happening, we lose the fear We understand and we feel a positive, and we can see a positive and proactive way forward. It gives us the power. This is what Dr. Hammer has given to us in German New Medicine. The responsibility for our health and our well-being belongs with each and every one of us individually. And this is my most, I can't say this more truthfully, right? If we learn the basics of GNM, we can see life and illness through a completely different set of eyes. We see we see clearly that the perfection and the wisdom of our living bodies. It's never trying to cause us or catch diseases or have a weak immune system. Immune system doesn't even come into it because we don't have one. We have a support system. Nothing's attacking us. All microorganisms are part of this system. So there are no germs trying to stricken us or cancers trying to kill us. Only a perfect biological system evolved to help us live long and happy lives if we only understood this. It is our misunderstanding and false beliefs which trick us into thinking otherwise. And this is the gentleman here. That was him probably around about 2006 or 7, I believe. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Right, I'm back. Or you're back on my screen anyway. Can you see me now?
Yeah, see you there. All
right.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. So, that was it.
I don't know if you want to stop recording now.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian.